The storm that had been building within the family finally broke on a night that seemed ordinary at first. Rain pounded against the windows, the streets were slick with water, and the town lay quiet under the weight of the weather. Inside the house, Emily moved through her evening routine, but unease gnawed at her. Earlier that day she had overheard David on the phone. His tone was low, urgent and sharp, the kind of voice he used only when trying to control a situation that was already slipping away. Though she could not hear every word, the name Sarah slipped out more than once, enough to confirm what she had feared, but had been too afraid to say aloud. Confrontation was inevitable. When David returned home that night, Emily could no longer hold back. She questioned him directly, her suspicion spilling into anger. David tried to deflect, clinging to excuses he had rehearsed in his head. But Emily had reached the breaking point. The walls of secrecy that had kept the affair hidden began to crack under the weight of her demands. In desperation, David raised his voice, swearing there was nothing between him and Sarah, but the raw panic in his denial betrayed him. Emily left the house that night with a determination he had never seen in her before. Instead of cooling her anger, the storm outside seemed to match the fury within her. She drove to Sarah's apartment, intent on hearing the truth face to face. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting through the thin walls, voices raised and sharp, words laced with betrayal. What was said between the two sisters that night would never be fully known, but it ended in silence. Hours later, Sarah was seen leaving the building alone, her hair damp from the rain, her expression tense and unreadable. The next morning, Emily's body was discovered near the riverbank, her clothing torn, her skin bruised, her lifeless form partially concealed by reeds and mud. It was a local fisherman who stumbled across her, his horrified shouts drawing the attention of authorities. The scene did not look like a random act of violence. Her purse remained untouched, her wedding ring still on her finger. To investigators, it was clear that the crime had been personal. The shock rippled through the community like an earthquake. Emily, who had always been known for her warmth and kindness, was gone in an act of brutality that no one could comprehend. The once proud image of her family shattered instantly, and suspicion spread rapidly. Police turned their attention inward, focusing on those closest to her. David, now a widower overnight, was questioned extensively. He presented himself as devastated, his voice trembling as he spoke of his loss, but his answers to basic questions wavered. He contradicted himself about where he had been that night, and officers noted the unease that hung around him like a shadow. Attention soon shifted to Sarah. Investigators learned of her frequent visits to Emily's home, her closeness to David, and the whispers of something more. When Sarah was brought in for questioning, her behavior drew even more suspicion. She avoided eye contact, her hands fidgeted constantly, and her story about the previous night changed under pressure. Forensic evidence then dealt the most damaging blow. Traces of Emily's blood were found in Sarah's car, a discovery that could not be explained away by coincidence. The narrative that the family had carefully hidden was finally unraveling. The affair was no longer just a dangerous secret. It had become the motive in a crime that tore the community apart. What had once been seen as an enviable family life had collapsed into betrayal, suspicion, and death. With each passing hour, the evidence mounted, and the lines between victim, conspirator, and perpetrator blurred. The storm that had begun with desire and deception now revealed itself as a tragedy of obsession, where loyalty had been traded for lust, and love for violence. The days following Emily's death brought waves of grief, confusion, and suspicion that rolled through the town like an unstoppable tide. The investigation gained momentum quickly, and detectives began piecing together a timeline that grew darker with every discovery. The case was no longer about a simple tragedy. It was about betrayal at the deepest level, the destruction of a family from within. As evidence surfaced, the illusion of David as a grieving husband collapsed, and Sarah's image as the carefree younger sister dissolved into something far more sinister. Detectives traced financial records and uncovered a disturbing pattern. Bank statements showed that David had been funneling money to Sarah for months, paying her rent, covering her utilities, and even making large cash withdrawals that coincided with her expenses. It painted the picture of a man who was not only entangled emotionally, but also financially dependent on the continuation of their secret relationship. Messages retrieved from Sarah's phone added even more weight to the theory of conspiracy. The words exchanged between her and David revealed a toxic mix of desire, frustration, and mounting pressure. Sarah pushed for a future together, demanding that David leave Emily, while David responded with vague reassurances and empty promises that only escalated the tension. When investigators confronted Sarah, she admitted to meeting Emily on the night of the murder, but claimed it was nothing more than a heated argument. She insisted she had left her sister alive, blaming Emily's death on an unknown intruder or accident. Yet, the forensic evidence told a different story. Emily's blood was in Sarah's car, and fibers from Sarah's clothing matched those found at the scene by the riverbank. Each piece of evidence chipped away at her defense until her version of events seemed hollow and desperate. David, on the other hand, presented himself as a victim caught in the middle of two women. He denied any involvement in Emily's death, insisting that he had been home that night, though his timeline was riddled with inconsistencies. He portrayed Sarah as unstable, suggesting that she had acted out of jealousy and rage, but detectives saw through his attempts to distance himself. His financial support, his intimate messages, and his reluctance to end the affair all pointed to a deeper level of involvement. As the case moved toward trial, the community turned cold. Neighbors who once admired the family now whispered in disgust about betrayal and greed. Parents warned their children about the dangers of secrets and lies, using the case as a cautionary tale. The courtroom became the center of attention, packed with spectators eager to witness the unraveling of a scandal that had destroyed 3 lives. The prosecution argued that David and Sarah had conspired together, driven by passion and desperation, planning Emily's death so they could finally be together without obstacles. They presented the financial ties, the incriminating messages, and the forensic evidence as proof of a calculated plan gone horribly wrong. The defense countered by painting Sarah as the sole perpetrator, consumed by jealousy and anger. They argued that David had been weak but not violent, a man trapped by his own mistakes, but incapable of murder. They claimed Sarah acted alone in a moment of rage after Emily confronted her, and that David's only crime was his silence and infidelity. The courtroom buzzed with tension as witnesses testified. Experts explained forensic findings, and every detail of the family's private life was exposed to the public. For Emily's relatives, the pain was immeasurable. Her children sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, too young to understand the full scope of what had been lost, but old enough to feel the weight of absence. Every revelation cut deeper, every accusation widened the wound. What had begun as whispers of an affair now stood exposed as a story of betrayal, greed, and death. The trial was no longer just about justice for Emily. It was about deciding whether David and Sarah's twisted bond was built only on deceit, or whether it had been strong enough to drive them both to murder. The trial reached its final weeks under a cloud of tension that hung heavy in the courtroom. Every seat was filled, every face intent on hearing how the story would end. Prosecutors presented their closing arguments with precision, reminding the jury of the blood evidence, the financial entanglements, and the messages that spoke of promises and demands. They argued that David and Sarah had been bound together by passion and greed, conspiring to remove the one person who stood in their way. The defense fought to separate the two, portraying David as a flawed husband who had made mistakes but not a killer, while painting Sarah as a woman consumed by jealousy who had snapped when her sister confronted her. The jury deliberated for days, weighing each piece of evidence, dissecting the lies, and searching for truth in a case where truth had been buried beneath years of secrecy. When the verdicts were read, the atmosphere was electric. Sarah was found guilty of second-degree murder, the weight of the word echoing through the courtroom as she broke down in tears. The sentence that followed promised decades behind bars, years that would stretch into a lifetime of regret. David, however, was spared the same fate. Though acquitted of direct involvement in the killing, he was convicted of obstruction and conspiracy, the court ruling that his silence, deceit, and financial support had fueled the chain of events that ended in Emily's death. His sentence was lighter, but the punishment was greater than any number of years could measure. His name, his reputation, and his family were all destroyed. In the aftermath, the community struggled to process what had happened. The family that once seemed like an emblem of stability had collapsed under the weight of betrayal. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal, and neighbors spoke in hushed tones whenever David's name was mentioned. The children, now without their mother and effectively without their father, were placed in the care of relatives. Their childhood was marked not by school plays or family outings but by whispers, stares, and the knowledge that the people who should have protected them had instead torn their lives apart. David returned to an empty home once the trial concluded, the silence inside louder than any crowd. The walls that once echoed with laughter now served as reminders of everything he had lost. He lived under the shadow of his choices, stripped of dignity and condemned to a lifetime of regret. Sarah's prison sentence removed her from the world she once craved, leaving her to reflect on how quickly obsession had destroyed everything. For Emily's family, justice was only a hollow comfort. No verdict could bring her back, no prison walls could undo the pain of betrayal, and no amount of time could erase the scar left by her absence. The story lingered in the town long after the court closed its doors. It became a whispered warning, a tale parents told their children about the dangers of lies, secrecy, and unchecked desire. Emily was remembered as a woman who trusted too deeply, Sarah as a sister whose jealousy consumed her, and David as a man whose weakness cost him everything. The affair that had begun as stolen glances and late night whispers ended in prison cells, shattered lives, and a grave by the river. The tragedy showed that once trust is broken and betrayal takes root, the destruction spreads like fire, leaving nothing but ashes behind. David and Emily lived in a quiet town, where people measured success not by wealth, but by appearances. They had been married nearly a decade, with 2 children who attended the local school and a home that seemed to embody stability. Neighbors often saw them together at church, community events, and Sunday barbecues, smiling as though nothing in the world could disturb their harmony. But behind the neat curtains of their suburban house, the marriage had begun to fray. Emily spent much of her time focused on the children, her attention wrapped around their routines and needs. David, meanwhile, felt neglected, craving affection and excitement he no longer found in his marriage. The shift began innocently, at least from the outside. Emily's younger sister Sarah had always been around. She was 5 years younger, single, and had a spontaneous personality that contrasted sharply with Emily's measured and responsible demeanor. Sarah came over frequently, sometimes to help with the children, sometimes just to spend time with her sister. At first, David saw her as nothing more than family, but subtle changes crept in over time. Her laughter lingered in his mind, her playful nature reminded him of what life felt like before responsibility weighed him down, and he began noticing her in ways that unsettled him. The turning point came one late evening, when Emily had taken the children to visit their grandmother, leaving David and Sarah alone. What began as light conversations stretched into hours, both of them sipping wine as the night deepened. The boundaries blurred, and though they said little of importance, an unspoken connection formed. From that night forward, David could not ignore the growing pull. Soon their interactions became charged, and what started as stolen glances and accidental touches transformed into deliberate meetings away from Emily's eyes. The affair was hidden in shadows, fueled by secrecy and adrenaline. They met at Sarah's apartment, at motels outside town, and sometimes even in the dark corners of their own neighborhood, careful not to be seen. Each meeting deepened the risk, but neither wanted to stop. For David, Sarah filled the emptiness he felt in his marriage, while Sarah, used to being overshadowed by her older sister, reveled in having something Emily could not imagine. In small towns, however, secrecy is fragile. People notice patterns, and rumors begin with the smallest observations. A neighbor recalled seeing David's truck parked outside Sarah's apartment more than once, always late at night. Another remembered Sarah skipping family gatherings without explanation, only to reappear days later with a restless energy. The whispers began slowly, spreading like fire under dry leaves, until they became impossible to ignore. Emily sensed the change as well. She noticed David's distance, the way he avoided her gaze, the excuses about late meetings and long drives. She saw Sarah more often than before, and though it should have comforted her, something about it unsettled her. She brushed the thoughts aside at first, convincing herself she was overthinking. But doubt festered beneath the surface. The perfect picture of her family began to feel like a fragile painting, one crack away from shattering. David and Sarah, caught in the rush of their own secret world, ignored the dangers looming over them. They believed they could keep their affair hidden, as though passion and deception could coexist indefinitely without consequence. But in reality, the ground beneath them was already crumbling. Every lie told, every secret meeting, and every stolen moment brought them closer to the inevitable. What began as desire would soon spiral into betrayal, destruction, and a darkness that none of them could have imagined. As the weeks turned into months, the affair between David and Sarah grew deeper and more reckless. What had begun as fleeting moments stolen in secrecy now consumed their thoughts. Sarah, who once felt conflicted about betraying her sister, no longer hesitated. She thrived on the danger, convincing herself that she had finally found someone who understood her. David, torn between guilt and desire, felt trapped in a life that seemed to be spiraling out of his control. His marriage to Emily, once the center of his world, had become a routine of obligations, while Sarah gave him a sense of youth and excitement that he desperately craved. At first, Sarah accepted the role of being hidden, content with the thrill of knowing she had what Emily did not. But soon the secrecy began to weigh on her. She wanted more than hurried meetings and whispered promises. She wanted David to herself, openly and permanently. Every time David went home to Emily, Sarah felt anger boiling beneath her skin. It wasn't enough to be his escape. She wanted to be his future. The more she demanded, the more pressure David felt, caught between the expectations of his family and the magnetic pull of Sarah's obsession. Emily, meanwhile, felt her world shifting in subtle but undeniable ways. David no longer looked at her the same way. He was distant during conversations, distracted during family dinners, and often away from home with vague excuses about work or errands. When Sarah began visiting more frequently, Emily's unease grew. Her sister, once a source of comfort, now seemed to hover too close to her husband, her laughter echoing in ways that left Emily unsettled. She told herself she was imagining things, that paranoia was clouding her judgment, but the feeling lingered like a shadow she could not shake. The tension grew heavier when Emily discovered a small necklace under the couch, delicate and unfamiliar. When she held it up and asked Sarah about it, the younger woman brushed it off with a forced smile, claiming it was old and misplaced. Emily let it go in that moment, but something inside her hardened. She began watching more carefully, noticing how Sarah avoided her gaze, and how David flinched at certain questions. The seeds of suspicion had been planted, and though she had no proof, Emily began piecing together fragments of a truth too painful to admit. David, sensing Emily's growing awareness, became more reckless in his attempts to keep both worlds intact. He started giving Sarah money, paying her rent and covering expenses she claimed she couldn't manage on her own. These financial ties only deepened the bond, making it harder for him to walk away even as guilt consumed him. Sarah, emboldened by this support, began to push for more, telling David that promises were no longer enough. She wanted him to leave Emily, to make their relationship legitimate in the eyes of everyone. But David was paralyzed by fear. Leaving Emily meant destroying his reputation, breaking apart his family, and facing the shame of betrayal in a town where everyone knew each other's business. He tried to placate Sarah with vague reassurances, but each excuse only fueled her frustration. Her patience wore thin, and the jealousy she once kept hidden began to spill over. She no longer saw Emily as her sister, but as an obstacle standing in the way of the life she deserved. The affair had started as an escape, a secret that seemed thrilling in its danger. Yet now it carried the weight of obsession, deception, and growing resentment. Sarah's fixation was no longer about love, but about possession. David's weakness left him unable to choose, and Emily's suspicions were sharpening into something dangerous. The fragile balance they clung to was breaking apart, and none of them realized that the choices they were making were already leading them down a path that could only end in disaster.